Great, thank you. And just as a moment of housekeeping, there will be a break right following this presentation. Great, good morning, everyone. My name is Edward Tentoff, and I'm a Managing Director and Senior Biotech Analyst at Piper Jaffray. And I'd like to start by thanking the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine for sponsoring this event today. Piper Jaffray is pleased to co-sponsor the Regenerative Medicine Investor Day for its second year, and it's my pleasure to moderate our first panel of the day, which is entitled Advanced Treatments for Cardiovascular Disease. Before I begin, I am required to point out certain disclosures regarding my coverage universe. And just to get us all oriented, cardiovascular disease, as you likely know, is not a single disease, but really a collection of life-threatening disorders that affect the heart, including atherosclerosis, heart attack, arrhythmias, heart failure, valve problems, and stroke or cerebral vascular disorders. And the causes of these conditions vary as well. Thanks to innovation over the last several decades, standard of cardiac care has made dramatic progress. And today, cardiologists have a variety of weapons in their armamentarium, including medication, angioplasty and stents, pacemakers, ICDs, CABG surgery, and even heart replacement to treat the various disorders that we represented on the last slide. Yet still, cardiovascular disease represents a huge unmet medical need. And while the death rate has declined an impressive 31% from 2000 to 2010, almost 800,000 Americans died from cardiovascular disease in 2010, according to the AHA. And cardiovascular disease remains the #1 killer in the United States. Coronary heart disease resulted in 380,000 deaths in the US, and despite a 23% decline, almost 800,000 Americans suffered a stroke, and 130,000 Americans died from a stroke in 2010. Over 1 million hospitalizations and almost 280,000 deaths were attributed to heart failure. Needless to say, the expense of all this morbidity and mortality is an enormous drain on the US healthcare system. Cardiovascular disease is a growing global problem, and according to the World Health Organization, 17.3 million people died across the globe of cardiovascular disease in 2008, making it the #1 killer worldwide as well. Ischemic heart disease, which is the international definition for coronary heart disease, resulted in 7.25 million deaths, and 6.15 million people died from a stroke worldwide in 2008. So I come back to the slide on the current treatments and say we need new solutions, and maybe regenerative medicine can play a role in solving these global problems. So with that background, I'm joined by a distinguished panel of experts and researchers in the field of cell therapy for the treatment of cardiovascular disease. Farthest to my left is Dr. Andrew Pecora, who's the Chief Visionary Officer at Neostem and a co-founder and CMO of Progenitor Cell Therapy, and also the CSO of Amercyte. Dr. Pecora serves as the Chief Innovation Officer at the John Theuer Cancer Center at Hackensack University Medical Center and is a professor of medicine at the University of Medicine and Dentistry School of New Jersey, from where he received his medical doctorate. Next to Dr. Pecora is Dr. Mark Penn, who's Director of Research at the Summa Cardiovascular Institute. Dr. Penn is the founder and the CMO of Juventus, which is a presenting company that will present this afternoon, I believe. And he has also worked with other stem cell therapy companies, including Athersys, which I currently cover. Dr. Penn received his MD from Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine and did his internship, residency, and fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic. Next to Dr. Penn is Dr. Thomas Posik, Associate Professor of Medicine at Duke University Medical Center. Dr. Posik is an interventional cardiologist who's interested in the advancement of treatments for patients with advanced coronary artery disease and heart failure, including the use of novel, regenerative, or cell-based treatments. Dr. Posik has been involved with the Baxter and the Cytori trials, if I'm not mistaken, amongst others at Duke, and received his MD from Harvard Medical School and did his residency and fellowship at Duke. And lastly, Dr. Andrei Terzik is the Michael S. and Mary Sue Shannon Director of the Mayo Clinic Center for Regenerative Medicine. And Dr. Qaqc is a professor of medicine and pharmacology, the chair of Discovery Translation Advisory Board, director of the Marriott Heart Disease Research Program, and director of the National Institute's Cardiovascular Program. Dr. Qaqc received his MD from the University of Belgrade and got his PhD from the University of Illinois. So I want to sincerely thank our panelists for joining us today. So thanks to Bob's presentation and the fireside chat that got us started off this morning, I think we all have an understanding of what these cells are. And I wanted to begin our discussion today by asking really how they're working, how these cells are actually working to treat cardiovascular disease. Are these cells actually incorporating and regenerating new cardiac tissue? Or is it more that they're releasing factors to help cells repair and heal themselves? And I'll ask Dr. Penn to get us started.
Thank you. Our focus of my laboratory and our clinical program has really been on this concept that stem cell-based repair is actually a very natural process, but clinically inefficient, not because we lack stem cells, but we lack the molecular mechanisms that really drive the process to clinical completion. And we believe that exogenous stem cell therapy, particularly for the heart, really works through multiple mechanisms, but the most important one being induction of an endogenous stem cell system and driving that system to some completion to clinical benefit. So, whether it's a mesenchymal stem cell or CD34 cells that respond to those signals, we're able to induce a natural process to induce clinical benefit. And that's ultimately how they're working. Now, depending on who you ask, there's different paracrine factors that are released by different cells that lead to the clinical benefit being regrowth of new tissue, regrowth of new blood vessels, nutrifying the heart more, and the recruitment of cardiac stem cells and plus minus true cardiac regeneration. But I think the majority of data, although different for different disease processes, stroke may be more of an immune modulation issue. It's really about inducing something that we as mammals can do naturally, but we've evolved away from doing it well.
Great. And Dr. Posik or Andre, do you have anything to add? Or Andrew, do you have any other comments or thoughts?
No, I think that the idea that the cells that get injected themselves repopulate or regenerate the heart directly is probably not something that most people believe. And I would agree with what Mark said, is that we're somehow augmenting nature's own reparative capacity, which is, in more primitive systems is much more robust. So in zebrafish, they'll regenerate a whole heart after you resect a certain amount of heart muscle. And the question is, can we use regenerative therapy to somehow recapitulate that process in more advanced animals like ourselves?
No, I will underscore what you have heard. In other words, there is more and more understanding that our heart has indeed this ability of self-renewal, and maybe it's not as robust as when you cut your skin and the skin will heal so readily, or you give part of your liver to a patient in need. But the heart also has that ability to repair, and we repair roughly at 1% per year naturally. So this is sufficient maybe for daily needs, but it's insufficient, obviously, when the heart is hit by a heart attack. And so regenerative medicine comes as a solution to this limited self-healing capacity, but essentially boosting the ability of self-renewal. And so the technologies that are being built today have that ability to essentially upgrade the regenerative intrinsic capacity of our heart.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, there's a very key biologic concept here, which we call a cascading effect. So organs are capable of regenerating their own function, any organ in the body, given the right set of circumstances and the right intervention. We do it now in cardiology. Afterload reduction in people in heart failure actually not only allows you to pump blood better, but you actually see changes in the heart itself. So this is not an uncommon thing. And the interaction between the cells and that you're infusing and the organ into which you're infusing the cells is a complex biologic process that cascades the effect over time.
So is it really a matter then of delivering more of these regenerative cells to the site of injury? And how important is the source of these cells, whether it be autologous or from the patients themselves or allogeneic from a donor?
Yeah, so let me address the cell number issue and then hand it over to my colleagues about the cell type. So in bone marrow transplantation, we spent multiple decades trying to figure out what is the minimum number of cells you need to ensure engraftment, either in an autologous or an allogeneic setting. And what we learned is it's not a number. It's actually a threshold effect. So there are biologic, depending upon the individual, biologic restrictions or blockades that in one person will require more cells than another. So the bottom line is you need to exceed a certain threshold, after which you will see an effect in an ever-increasing number of patients. And then the drug we're developing, AMR-001, that's in fact what we found in our phase 1 trial. When we gave a low dose of cells, we didn't see the effect. Once we hit a certain level and above, we saw the effect in everybody.
I think, with respect to autologous or allogeneic and which strategy may or may not be better, I think there's a scientific component to that, but just as importantly, there's a clinical component to that. You need to develop product that fits into the clinical workflow so that you're not extending length of stay, you have a good chance of success, you're not using up valuable resources, cath lab time, things of that nature. So you can imagine in a setting of acute MI when patients have to go to the cath lab, emergently, an allogeneic off-the-shelf product is probably clinically preferred. We need to validate that it's scientifically appropriate. Where in heart failure, when you have a lot of injured tissue and you have time to treat, a more robust therapy that optimizes those cells fits the clinical workflow and may be necessary to have the benefit. So I think we really do have to fold in the clinical indication when we're looking at what cell type is best, not just scientifically.
I think that the field is also evolving to understand that the initial paradigm that we had, which was very simplistic, just taking cells from a source, let's say the bone marrow, blood, or fat, will magically deliver success once injected, even if we upscale the dose. That simplistic paradigm clearly has not necessarily paid full dividend. And one of the skepticism in the field has been, despite a variety of strategies being attempted, essentially this initial experience was based on simply taking cells the way they are in different parts of our body. But I think what is evolving increasingly is the understanding that we need to optimize this regenerative capacity, and that's what Dr. Penn just pointed out. There is a need of optimization, and this optimization is in essence targeting the ability to ultimately provide a cardioreparative cell, and that's the goal where the field is right now. And we can discuss some specifics as the discussion goes on.
Great. And I believe as we look at where we are today in terms of clinical development for cell therapy for cardiovascular disease, it's certainly one of the areas that's make the most grounds and probably with the most significant number of clinical trials. And I think that it's largely agreed that experts agree that we've cleared the hurdle of safely delivering stem cells to patients in a variety of different diseases. Have there been any safety signals along the way, and are there any concerns that we still need to worry about as we design these cardiovascular trials, or are we kind of all in clear when it comes to safety?
Well, I'll comment. So I think that overall the safety signal has been very positive for almost all, especially for the autologous cells, which have been studied to a much greater degree so far than allogeneic cells and are much farther in the development process. There's no signal that the cells themselves cause any safety issue, except for possibly with the exception of myoblasts, which may have an arrhythmogenicity associated with them. But I think it's important to understand that I would say that clinically, we should never say that something's safe. I mean, for years and years and years, we took ibuprofen and we thought it was safe. Now we know that it's associated with a slight increased risk of cardiovascular events. So safe is a relative term. Has there been any signal that at least the cells themselves are not safe? For autologous, I would say uniformly not, and there's been meta-analyses published which have shown that there's trends toward a lower risk of cardiovascular events with patients who get cell therapy compared with patients who get injected with placebo. When we give these cells, anytime you do a procedure, there is always going to be some, we hope, low risk associated with giving these cells to patients. I think overall the data suggests that long term, that risk is going to be more than overcome by potential benefit of these cells. But I've heard people say things like, well, we know these cells are safe, so we should just be giving them to patients. And I think it's important to understand that safe is always has to be taken into the context of what you're discussing.
And with this concept that we were talking about, where the cells are actually more causing a paracrine effect rather than actually incorporating, where do these cells actually go as they're being introduced to the body, and how are they cleared from the body?
Well, that really depends. Go ahead. It really depends on what cell you're talking about. If you're talking about a mesenchymal stem cell infused IV, they sit in the lungs for a few days and they seem to percolate to the heart in response to various signals. CD34 cells don't lodge in the lung and probably go straight to wherever they're being signaled to. If you're doing intracoronary infusion, probably a better chance of getting them into the myocardium because you're delivering them there. So I think it's a delivery question as well as a cell type.
Yeah. Yes.
Well put, Dr. Penn. So I guess really moving to the crux of the discussion here and what came up earlier, the need to generate efficacy data. You've all agreed that we're really at this crucial period of development for stem cell therapies where clinical data is going to be coming. One of the challenges has been in our discussions to prepare for this panel was that proof of concept studies to date may have been too small to really generate a robust enough signal. So what does the field need to show, and what are some of the most important studies that are going to be coming out in upcoming months? And I'll ask Dr. Posik to start us off on that one.
Yeah, so well, I would say coming from an academic research institution that runs worldwide mega trials that enroll tens of thousands of patients, what we need is the type of investment that I think Big Pharma is beginning to make to run trials that are designed to really show adequate efficacy signal. So that means, not trying to show huge improvements, but to design trials that are going to show the types of improvements that are realistic within a clinical program. And I think I think there are several companies that are, putting forth trials that are designed to do these things. So I hope that the field is beginning to reach sort of this inflection point that was talked about this morning, where people are beginning to say, I'm really going to put the effort and the resources into this to see if this really, really works.
I think from one point of view, we need to have larger trials, placebo-controlled, that allow us to interpret, efficacy. But I think we also have to look at what the efficacy endpoints are. One of the challenges, I was the PI of the Athersys Qaqc trial. We had, I think to date, still the largest effect in acute MI seen in any cell therapy trial as far as on ejection fraction. The challenge there is that ejection fraction isn't an approvable endpoint. So, good for us, but, where does that really move the indication? In response to that, we were recently, Athersys was recently awarded an SBIR to go and do a non-ST elevation MI study, smaller infarcts, but in a clinical population that has a high clinical event rate, heart failure, reinfarction. Those are approvable clinical endpoints. So it's exciting to see EFs go up, but particularly for, I'm sure, the investment community, and frankly, from the physician point of view, wanting this in our armamentarium, we need to start doing clinical trials that have clinical endpoints that lead to approval. In the heart failure space, that's easier because the measures that we take, and we did in Juventus and Andre did in Cardio 3, the measures we take even in proof of concept studies are approvable endpoints. So we can translate those easier to phase 2 and phase 3 trials. But in the acute infarct setting, it's really hard to find endpoints that can lead to approval because, quite frankly, patients with their first ST elevation MI do quite well for quite some time. And those need to be very large trials that follow patients for quite some time.
Andre, please.
Just to underscore what we are hearing, it's an extremely exciting time. I think on one hand, we see a maturity of clinical trials as we reach to phase 3 trials for cardiovascular diseases. I will point out to 2 phase 3 trials that exemplifies essentially the 2 main substrates that we're trying to treat. In the acute myocardial infarction setting, the BAMI trial ongoing or will be ongoing soon in Europe. And then in a more chronic setting, in the heart failure setting, the first phase 3 trial in that space is a Chart-1 trial run in Europe and Israel, and at the same time starting as Chart-2 in the United States. So the field has clearly matured so that the initial trial experiences have shown not only feasibility and safety as discussed previously, but clearly efficacy signals that allow us now to step into these pivotal phase 3 trials. The other aspect that is very exciting is these initial platforms that we have built really our experiences on in terms of feasibility and safety have been, as we go further, have been refined. And so we're not relying necessarily on the original technologies that have been put forward, let's say, roughly a decade ago. But as the years have been progressing, and with the understanding what we are really treating, we have come to the realization that there is indeed a need to optimize the biotherapeutic, to optimize the regenerative capacity, essentially, of the biological product. And so there are various ways to ensure that optimization. And just to highlight 2 main philosophies there, one would be to target actually the organ itself. Can we condition this diseased organ, this diseased heart, so it can become more amenable to repair? And there is a lot of efforts in that space. And then something that the Mayo Clinic, in partnership with Cardio 3 Biosciences, and you will hear more presentation by Cardio 3 this afternoon, has been focusing for a number of years, is how to optimize the cell itself. And so the concept of lineage specification, in other words, instilling a cardiogenic trait into a stem cell, has been viewed as a unique way, very powerful way to ensure potentially an upgraded cardiac repair at the outcome. And the Chart-1, Chart-2 trials that I mentioned, those phase 3 trials, are testing the very favorable indications from previous trials in terms of overall benefit in patients with heart failure.
Great. And I know just from an investor standpoint, we're trying to figure out what are the milestones that investors can look for to de-risk this space and have a investable, make investment opinion to this space. So what are you saying that there is less value to be gleaned from the phase 2 studies? And what phase 2 studies that are coming out in the near term are you guys going to be focused on?
So I think one of the exciting phase 2 trials that will come out this year, because it's a huge unmet clinical need, is actually the atherosclerosis stroke trial. We haven't had a new therapy in stroke for a long time, and the phase 2 trial hopefully will be out this year. And if it shows promise, I think it'll have a huge impact on a clinical population that has not a lot of hope. At Juventus with JVS 100, the SDF1 cDNA, we'll have a phase 2 trials, maybe 3, out later this year, looking at heart failure, critical limb ischemia, and 2 different delivery systems for heart failure. And that'll actually be directly looking at, just induction of the endogenous system using drug therapy instead of cell therapy. So those are 2 that I know of that I'm pretty excited to see.
And Andrew, I know you're excited to see the Emersite study, so tell us about that one.
Yeah, so I want to go back a little bit. Some of the comments made before are important, but the Hayes, going back to what Perry said before about following the biology, The haze is getting a little clearer, at least where we're developing. We have a fundamental understanding of how the cells track to where they need to go, why they go there, why they stay there, and what they do. And as a consequence of that, we've been able to target a population that is at high risk for events, not at low risk, but at high risk for events. And we have a phase 2 trial that's completed and coming out this year that will, I think, be fairly definitive regarding whether or not an applied CD34 cell in the setting of AMI can preserve organ function. In regard to approvable endpoints, that isn't as set in stone as once thought, particularly around the globe. There are other developed nations, not in the US, but other developed nations that are looking at preservation of heart muscle function as an approvable endpoint, as an example. And I think that, getting back to a comment made before that I completely agree to, and it may become a cell therapy dictum, is that if there's a small effect, a minimal effect, if you have to do 2,000, 3,000 patient trials to see a 2% benefit, you're probably not going to have a commercializable product, because I don't know of a single cell therapy, allogeneic or autologous, that's going to be inexpensive to deliver. I think they're all going to be relatively expensive to deliver. So in the current climate of value-based healthcare reimbursement, you're going to want to have a robust effect. And our phase 2 trial that will be out this year is looking for that robust effect.
Excellent. And I guess back to clinical endpoints then and regulatory endpoints. So if we're really looking for a dramatic effect, that should make it easier then to design the studies. So is it really just a matter of sitting down with the different regulatory agencies and getting agreement on endpoints? Or do you think that the effect size that we're going to see are going to be large enough that we're going to know whether or not these therapies are working?
Well, I can only speak for our experience. I can't speak for everyone else's. But in our experience, regulators around the world are engaged in a dialogue that they weren't 5 years ago. That is a fact. And that the thought processes around what's an approvable endpoint is an evolution. And in saying that, if you show a meaningful benefit as a surrogate of long downstream benefits, so an example in AMI, if you can preserve heart muscle function, if you can prevent a chronic steady deterioration in the heart muscle's function over time by a single event, you may not have to wait for that to translate into counting event rates and 5 years later. You may, but you may not. That's sort of the dialogue where it is right now.
Our experience is also very much in that space. In other words, the regulatory agencies become a very integral part of that discussion, and as we're learning, they're also learning with us in the process. The experiences also across the Atlantic are very unique, and so learning from what is happening in the United States versus Europe and vice versa, I think is very important. So in the upcoming Chart-1, Chart-2 trials that Cardio3 Biosciences will be running, essentially the European regulatory agencies went in the setting of heart failure for what we call composite clinical scores, which are increasingly used to, in other words, not rely just on a singular endpoint, but in a composite way see both the functioning structure of the heart, but also the overall fitness of the patient. In the United States, for a very similar trial, the FDA was more intrigued into a singular fitness type of overall fitness endpoint. In other words, the 6-minute walk test was selected. So there are different experiences across the Atlantic, but ultimately, I think bringing this data together will provide, I think, a comprehensive understanding of where these therapies are particularly important. And in that setting, I think 3 domains are being really discussed more and more, is to truly define what patients will benefit the most. I think there is a lot of discussions. Not all cardiovascular disease is the same substrate. So I think that's very, very important to distinguish. And within specific diseases, which patients are the most amenable to respond. And the second area is what ultimately biotherapeutic to use. And we heard before the idea also of combination therapies. And the ultimate goal there is how do you maximize your biotherapeutics? What are the tools that you use to ensure regenerative capacity? And then the third component is the delivery. So there is a lot of advances in the delivery space and ensuring that your delivery tools are indeed the most effective to enhance ultimately your outcome is the third triad, essentially, of that overall best practices as they're being built through these experiences right now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with much of what has been said about the cost of the therapy and the need for, you know, a good clinical effect, and what Mark said about the difficulty we have in phase 2, which is finding endpoints that correlate with clinical outcomes, which at least the FDA, I think, is much more, you know, I would say strict or robust about requiring strict clinical outcomes than maybe in other countries. But I would just caution that the overwhelming experience in the development of therapeutics is that in complex organisms like humans, most therapies have relatively modest clinical effects. Now, what that means, you know, may differ from one therapy to another, but to expect that we are going to achieve in humans what is done in mice or other preclinical models, I think is not realistic. I mean, I think all of us up here are obviously very interested in regenerative therapy and very enthusiastic about regenerative therapy, and I think it has incredible promise, but to power a study based on an overwhelming clinical effect, I guess I would be a little skeptical about us being able to achieve that at the current time.
So I have a question about the state of the regulatory agencies, and we were talking about this a little bit, and earlier we discussed this coming hockey stick curve of cell therapies. Do you think the regulatory agencies are ready for that kind of, you know, product flow and filing flow? Do they still have some learning to do? Do they have staffing needs to beef up? Where do you think the regulatory agencies are in preparation for this wave of regenerative medicine therapies that are coming?
Yeah, so my involvement in regenerative cell therapy from its inception, I've got to see the evolution of at least the FDA and its thinking. I think they've done a great job, and they deserve a ton of credit. You know, they overall are probably somewhat underfunded for all of bioscience, and particularly the pace of discovery now. But I think they're really doing their best to keep up. And you're seeing, at least I've seen, a greater tendency. They're not going to change being the FDA, but I've seen a greater tendency to really try to understand how what I'll call a surrogate endpoint, so in AMI, preservation of heart muscle function, not necessarily the EF going up, but you give something and people preserve heart muscle function to a much greater extent than if they don't get it, that will translate into a downstream survival benefit or composite endpoint. I've seen that dialogue now, whereas 3 years ago they wouldn't even talk about it. So I do think that they understand, the regulators understand the promise of regenerative medicine, because you think about it from a pharmacoeconomic perspective. If these therapeutics, either in cancer, cardiovascular, the other areas are being developed, truly are a one-time therapy or a two-time therapy, and they change the natural history of a disease, that could have a major societal impact. And that's not lost on the FDA.
Maybe to underscore this last point, I think very much so the idea of regenerative medicine providing what is being called the definitive solution, which current therapies come short of doing. I think it's ultimately the main promise of regenerative medicine, especially in the context of this pandemic of chronic diseases, cardiovascular diseases being, as pointed out earlier, the main example, with 1/3 of all global death due to cardiovascular disease. We have a moral obligation towards society to indeed perfect these regenerative solutions, to allow definitive solutions on one hand and limit what we call the revolving door, the patient going to the hospital with a chronic condition, being released after symptoms being treated, only to come back a few weeks or a few months later. So we have not really solved the underlying substrate of the disease. And that the next frontier, the vanguard really of regenerative medicine, lies in being able to legitimately go after the underlying substrate of disease. And that's what we all expect.
I found the FDA to be very collaborative in our work in Juventus with the gene therapy. They've wanted to learn. They've been very helpful. And through my limited interactions with them, with Athersys, similarly, very helpful, very engaged, and wanting to learn and help.
Great. So, Dr. Pym, before you mentioned the need to kind of work into the clinical flow, so beyond clinical data, beyond the regulatory issues, a lot of these kind of challenges that we've been touching on serially, what are some of the hurdles for stem cell therapy or gene therapy or regenerative medicines in general to be incorporated into the current treatment paradigm? And is this really therapy that can be delivered broadly, or is it going to be centralized in centers of excellence? How do you kind of see the therapies being delivered over time?
Well, as Tom can attest to more than I can, people come in with ST elevation MI 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if you're really going to broadly try to prevent in an optimal way, if you can have a therapeutic that's available anywhere, that doesn't take more than probably a half hour, 45 minutes to add at 2 o'clock in the morning, you have the biggest potential to have the largest impact. I think, to your point, from there comes down either a service-oriented strategy that treats the people who absolutely have to have it, maybe the bigger infarcts or the recurrent infarcts, that can be at most centers. And then you work your way all the way back to the centers of excellence for complex therapeutics that may take time. Ultimately, in a perfect world, we'd like to not extend length of stay. We'd like to, not invade the body a second time if we don't have to. But it ultimately comes down to the therapeutic efficacy and then the great mystery of how physicians choose to do what they do, and trying to encourage them along those lines for the specific therapy. So I think there's lots of potential different ways this is going to look in the clinic. But in the end, I think any physician wants to do the best for their patient and will want the most efficacious strategy that doesn't mess up the economics.
I'd like to address that. We've given a lot of thought to the practical nature, at least in the AMI setting. So when we were developing our therapeutic, we knew we had to extend its biologic shelf life. We understood the principal property the cell therapy had to have in order to remain efficacious. And when you take it out of the body, we learned early on, which almost killed the whole thing, that it doesn't last very long, that particular property. And we had to figure out a formulation to stabilize it and make it a pharmaceutical-grade therapeutic so that doctors could work 9 to 5 Monday through Friday and not have to come in the middle of the night. And the only other comment I'll make, particularly for the investors in the room, while it's good to hear generalities, the details really, really matter. And there are different details dependent on the clinical situation. One of the comments Dr. Penn appropriately made before is that you don't want to be giving an expensive cell therapy product to someone who doesn't need it. So unless there are serologic biomarkers that can predict at the time of an AMI that you're at risk for some downstream adverse clinical event, that may not be an appropriate strategy to give something to everybody at the time of the infarct. And you may want to wait a little bit of time to see how the heart's done. So there are details that really matter in this, but he's absolutely right, and I agree with this, is that if you're going to be commercially successful in this space, you can't add to the cost of delivery, and you have to minimize the complexity of it as you're developing your therapeutic.
Thomas, did you have a comment?
Yeah, well, I guess I have a couple comments now.
Yeah.
But I totally agree with what Dr. Pecora said. If you really want to understand something, it's hard to sit up here and make generalities about cell therapy products in general. You need to delve into the details of that particular product and how it's going to be given. So a product that's an off-the-shelf allogeneic product that can be given easily may be able to be disseminated and given in any cardiovascular clinic, very quickly. A product that requires intramyocardial injection may be much more centered at certain tertiary care centers, which are the tertiary care centers that are, doing transplantations and LVAD implantations. And but like everything else, PCI started as a very centralized, highly technology-dependent procedure, and now everyone does it. And LVADs started that way, and now LVADs are becoming more broadly introduced at a variety of centers. So, you know, certain things will start at highly localized, maybe tertiary care centers, but over time will be disseminated. But I think that one thing that people should understand is that I think the public is incredibly interested in this type of therapy, and once this type of therapy is approved, once the first, I think, therapy gets through the door, there will be an explosion of interest in this therapy, and especially for chronic conditions, you'll see, I think, rapid adoption of these types of therapies.
We also anticipate this rapid adoption, and I think the idea of ultimately cell therapy and regenerative approaches in general be more of a commodity. Obviously, it's not for today, but over time, with the experiences being built, that is a horizon. Also, not to forget that cardiovascular field evolves together with all the other fields of medicine and surgery, so the advances that will happen in other fields, I think, will benefit ultimately the overall regenerative, what we call regenerative model of care, as maybe the next frontier. Many of the clinical trials that we see today are also selecting healthcare systems and even purposely a variety of healthcare providers, especially, let's say, different countries, to see whether in different socioeconomic environments you can deploy this type of technology. So not only, let's say, in Western Europe, but also across the Central and Eastern Europe systems, which again provides an indicator of how early this type of technologies ultimately will be adopted and disseminated.
Yeah. And obviously with scale come the business economics to the delivery of these therapies. My last prepared question, and I kind of directed to Andrew initially, but I, open it to all of you. What will it take from a manufacturing standpoint or a Qaqc standpoint to get stem cell therapies or regenerative medicines approved and commercialized?
I think the first thing it's going to take is a therapy that really works. And once you have a therapy that really works, I think the rest will follow. I apologize for that superficial answer, but you heard the discussion by a little company called General Electric this morning and another small company called Celgene talking about it. If things have an effect size, and we've seen examples of this, even in the cardiovascular space, there are a couple of companies, including ours, that showed an effect size in early trials, if it gets repeated, is a pretty big effect size. And solutions will follow for the delivery of these therapies. Scaling, as discussed, I don't want to be repetitive, for an allogeneic product versus an autologous product are different. There are some similarities, but there's no physical barrier, there's no logistical barrier, there's no economic barrier for these things to occur. And that's why I asked the question I asked before. I don't know of any. I think it's a matter of, if something has a material effect, we're not talking, well, we may start in subset populations which will limit the number of patients for which these therapies are approved early on. Over time, they'll get distributed. You look at any drug, usually drugs start in a limited area and then expand over time. I don't see any real physical barrier for us to deliver either an autologous product at scale or an allogeneic product at scale with a cost of goods sold that's adequate for a proper margin for a company to do very well.
Right. So I'm going to open up the question to the audience. I apologize. I can't really see with these lights in my eyes. So if there are any questions, just please.
I'm having a little bit of a problem understanding stem cell therapy in the heart as opposed to other organs. All organs are dynamic in that they're not placid, but the heart is especially dynamic, and they're as a muscle or as an organ. Are there implicit limitations on how fast progress can be made here because of the dynamic nature of the heart movement? I'm asking a technical, scientific question as much as anything else, but intuitively, something that's beating pretty fast, has a whole bunch of electrical characteristics to it, poses a little bit different problem than a lung, a kidney, or something. Is that an incorrect assumption?
Yeah.
So my bias is yes. I think the heart is actually, because it moves and is a muscle, is actually ideal for what we do. The reason being, every cell is somehow connected to every other cell. And we've done studies preclinically that if you fix one part of the heart, the rest of the heart will remodel in response to that. If you fix one part of the liver, the rest of the liver may not know you fixed it and get better. But in the heart, because it's a muscle and they're all connected and it does beat, fixing part of it can in fact induce a global improvement.
Great. Yes, please.
You talked about having the cost not be additive, but you are looking at potentially curative solutions that may save costs over the long term, but will not necessarily in the immediate term be able to be helpful. How do you address that?
So it's a critical question, obviously, from a healthcare economics standpoint. I think in the chronic condition that you point out, let's say heart failure, if you look at the variety of cost associates, let's say, with the ultimate care in end-stage disease, going from support systems, LVADs, all the way to transplant, we're talking of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars per year sometimes for each of these patients. So having a solution that will deliver maybe an arrest of the progression of disease, if not restore the failing organ, is definitely here a game changer. So from a healthcare economics, the calculations are indeed very favorable for the regenerative solution.
And how would you build in something like that to be able to handle the fact that you're going to have to show that response over a long period of time?
Well, if you're talking about elderly patients under Medicare, functionally a single payer, it's not a hard equation to do. If you're talking about folks in their late 40s, early 50s, I hear your point. Somebody's going to pay for it and somebody else is going to get the benefit. But when you're talking about heart failure, I think it's an easier argument to make because of that.
Yes, please. In the back.
I'm curious as to how worried you are about the public policy environment that we're in today, where there is an environment of suspicion about science, about stem cells, and about, to some extent, even insurance. Are you worried that, that this could become a barrier?
If I could, I think there's some legitimate basis to all those worries because unfortunately, people have made claims without even biologic rationale around claims. What happened in Italy, that we're probably all familiar with as an example. And, patients are looking. I'm a cancer doctor. I have patients that travel to other countries that look for the miracle cure when there's no hope for them. People are still going to do that. I don't know many people that want to die prematurely. Having said that, I think the people up here in the companies you're going to hear from, including us, are spending a lot of time what I call connecting the dots, where we really take the time to understand the biologic, scientific rationale of why a therapeutic might work, show that in fact science is being replicated in vivo, show that effect has a meaningful effect on the organ and ultimately on the person. And it's the same rigor that any other company's developed any other drug goes through, and I don't see this field, because of the promise of cell therapy, avoiding that. I think we have to do that.
Thomas, did you?
I think those are all concerns that everyone in cardiovascular disease has, because we've gotten better at treating patients with a variety of cardiovascular conditions. But unfortunately, one of the things we're left with is people with a lot of end-stage cardiovascular disease, which is refractory angina, heart failure due to acute MI. Which, as has been stated, builds up costs. So I think it's going to be incumbent on sponsors to try to capture data that shows that the therapy is cost effective. And I think this morning, somebody mentioned that their biggest fear is that we would be set back by an adverse event or something like what happened with angiogenesis. I mean, I personally think that this field has now reached a level of maturity where an event like that wouldn't set the field back significantly because we have a large body of data that shows that cell therapy is safe. But I think what really sets the field back is when you have either basic researchers or clinical researchers who do things that aren't correct. And so we've, unfortunately, in the cell therapy field, or regenerative medicine field, had several cases of basic research which has been shown to be fraudulent, and we have to be very vigilant about that in clinical research, and that's more of an issue outside the United States than it is, within the United States.
Maybe just to highlight, obviously it's our duty to ensure that we're not building hype, but we're really building hope and solutions for our patients. But on the regional, national, international scale, there is more and more constituencies, legislature, and so on going forward in this direction. I just came from the hearings in the state of Minnesota with the Minnesota Senate and House, and clearly Minnesota will be the 15th or 16th state in the United States with having specific legislation in regenerative medicine. So the Regenerative Medicine Act is something that we work all together in building for this country, but also internationally, suggesting that the field, as pointed just now, is definitely maturing and is becoming part of the overall texture of a nation.
The unfortunate part's been that because of the hype, particularly outside the U.S., patients will seek it. They'll call and ask, do you have therapy? We'll have open trials, but they will rather spend significant sums of money than run the risk of being randomized to placebo. At some level, I feel bad for those folks because they're following something that really has little science behind it. But as Dr. Pecora says, patients will go anywhere to try and get therapy to help themselves.
And I have one final question to wrap us up, and this particularly, as I analyze the field and regenerative medicine in particular, I think you look at what are potential investment milestones or value drivers. And certainly the generation of clinical data is a big one, but also commercial alliances and commercial partnerships that can validate approaches and also bring in non-dilutive funding to companies and different efforts. And we have started to see big pharma express interest in cell therapy. Janssen's collaboration with Qaqc and Novartis's CAR-T technology with my alma mater, Penn. We have the the survey results that will be out today. So my question for the panel is, does Big Pharma know what they're doing? Or do these companies need to partner and buy their way into a space? And again, Perry mentioned antibodies earlier today, but much like what they've done in antibodies over the last decade.
Well, I won't answer that question, does Big Pharma know what they're doing, because we want to partner with them. But if you look at the history of innovation, right, in biotech or anything, and even you heard General Electric saying we need young entrepreneurial companies, more of them come into existence. Discovery in a new niche space is probably better served in smaller companies than large companies, by and large, not always, but by and large. But I do think that there's this momentum that we all heard about that is real, and you're going to see more deals.
Yeah, I mean, Mark and Andrew, they've formed companies, so they know this better than I do. But I think there's an incredible need for this transition point between proof of concept, idea, preclinical models, which can be funded with NIH funding and basic research funding, but then to translate that into the clinical data that is needed before Big Pharma comes in, it still seems to me as a big sticking point in the development of products.
And coming from the Mayo Clinic, I think one of the big players in this field will be the healthcare providers. So Mayo, for example, is investing and embracing regenerative medicine as an investment in the future of healthcare. So I think the partnership that you alluded to will definitely be needed. Our experiences with biotechnology companies in Europe, for example, Cardiovascular being one example, but others, I think is definitely a way that the field will evolve, creating essentially a community of practice and moving regenerative medicine forward.
Great. Well, I want to thank all four of you for being with us today and taking time out of your busy schedule, especially at such an exciting crossroads for the stem cell and regenerative medicine industry and cardiovascular disease. I want to wish you all the best in your studies coming up forward. And thank you all for attending and participating. And I next ask Josh Schimmer, my colleague, to come to the podium for the next panel. Thanks. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll have a break for how long, Murray? 15-minute break, and then we'll start up with the next panel. Thank you.